Welcome, everybody. We are now in one of the final panel sessions of the day. We're in the Americas for those who've been joining us already. And of course, we started in Asia and went through to Middle East and Europe, and delighted to have all these wonderful specialists and analysts and speakers with us today joining us. And for this session, we'll be discussing the geopolitics of America's energy independence, particularly under Trump 2.0. What will the implications be for China, India, and the global energy market? And I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Ziemba, Adjunct Fellow, Center for New American Security and a Senior Advisor at Horizon Engage, Dr. Raad Alkadiri, Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Bill Spindle, Senior Global Correspondent at Cipher News. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Great to have you with us. Raad, let me start with you because, let's start with you and, with the word geopolitics. We obviously had our fill of discussing that in the last year or two. It doesn't end. More fun and games to come, I'm sure, this year. But in the context of America's energy independence, and the fact that America now is the largest oil exporter and largest LNG exporter in the world, and under Trump, presumably that's going to at least stay as it is or strengthen. What does that mean on the geopolitical front for countries and big consumers like China and India? Any different from what they've already had under Biden, for example?
I think I would ask the question maybe the other way around, which is sort of less what geopolitics means for oil and gas and more how oil and gas, plays into a wider geopolitical change. I mean, geopolitics has always been there. It's nothing new. I think what's different now is that we're seeing systemic shifts. This isn't just event-driven, which tends to be the way that geopolitics is envisaged. What we are seeing potentially is a transformation of a world order. A US that is much more unilateral, or willing to be much more unilateral, willing to use its strength and its power in not in pursuit necessarily of an international system, but one that that serves its own interests more directly. And I think it's that aspect as much as any of the likely consequences of geopolitics that are really going to change. Now, let's see what Trump does when he comes in. But this, conceivably over the next 4 years, is going to be a global system transformed. And that's obviously going to have impacts on the energy sector, energy flows. And I would look at sort of that as perhaps being sort of one of the things that plays out is trade patterns as opposed to the volumes of trade. So it's less, which countries are going to be up, which countries are going to be down, how it's going to impact supply and demand in that sense, and more how the rewiring of the energy system takes place and the costs that come with that. And that really is a possibility over the next 4 years. That really is a possibility with this administration. We've seen rewiring in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But this is something, as I say, more systemic and will have sort of much longer ripple effects.
Okay, thanks, Raad. Rachel, let me go to you. I mean, from the American perspective as well. I mean, systemic changes, it's going to have impacts on the trade front, on flows. What would you identify, if you agree with Raad, on what that could be going forward, that's different from what we're already seeing perhaps gradually happen? What systemic change could happen, do you think, concrete wise, going forward in terms of those flows?
I do agree with Raad. I think he's framed it very well, in this sense of not only sort of the U.S. under Trump seeking to look at this differently, but also the implications of what the last several years have brought. I tend to think, we'll be watching this year to see what happens with the sanctions regimes against Russia, but also places like Iran, whether that will put different pressure on countries like China and India about where they're sourcing fuel, what that will do to prices and who carries it. In the last several years, we've seen a dynamic where natural gas trade has gone more onto ships instead of via pipeline, at, roughly speaking, at a global level. Oil is often going longer distances to get to refineries and then back to its end users, especially those in the West. And I think some of those trends are going to continue. The big shift, I do think, is also one, and we're seeing, Trump talk about tariffs on its largest trading partner, the only country that sends energy to the US, really, at this point, Canada, where I'm joining you from today. But so I think, and if that were the case, then the US would probably itself, in the short term, probably have to import more oil from further away, maybe Saudi Arabia. But looking past these pieces,
hence very unlikely. Hence, very unlikely
I think,
to happen. I mean,
hence unlikely. And I think then the real question is going to come back to how much will the policies that Trump and his team will have been trying to put in place about, or will try to put in place about more domestic production, how that will play out. My view is it will make it easier to pump and develop oil. But I see, just as producers all around the world, the producers in the US care about price. And so my view is we're going to see less production in the short term than maybe Trump would hope. Probably higher prices in the short term than Trump would hope. But I do think we're seeing very different sort of pressure on consumers to move to long-term contracts. And we're seeing a role, in my view, where some of these intermediaries that have come into the market to carry Russian fuel, a whole different set of shipping companies, some of these issues, I think, are set to continue, even if we see some, sanctions limbo and maybe even sanctions relief.
Thanks, Rachel. Bill, welcome again. How does this doubling down of Trump sort of on oil, on gas, presuming that it's going to happen, how does that fit in with also the parallel track of transition, energy transition, investing in clean technologies, a big part of the IRA Act that's been successful in America in the last 4 years, at least, in those new technologies. Do you see that will suffer as a result of Trump's emphasis on energy independence? I mean, the conventional energy independence.
Yeah, I again, like Rachel, agree with Rod's basic, analysis that we've been moving into this new paradigm, but it's been a pretty reasonably gradual and incremental process that goes back really even before 2016 Trump won. I think the big question that we need to look out for, maybe first half of the year or through the first year, is do we just jump both feet, plunge into this new paradigm, and really get off into a whole different world of different dynamics? And I think the question there is really how the interaction between the chaotic political environment in the U.S., how does that intersect with the chaotic trade or the chaotic economic situation in China? And that goes back to your question about a bit of energy transition, because if we really go off the rails into 60% tariffs on, you're really going to see the U.S. choked off from any sort of ability to import batteries. Already EVs are probably off the market, and that'll radiate out across the world and change dynamics there. So I think that's the big thing to watch, is whether we plunge both feet into this new world, or whether we just continue to wade into it, chaotic as even that will be. But that really is an easier to understand world, and one we can kind of apply our usual analytics to. If we get into this whole new world, it really is a whole new world.
Yeah, a lot of unknowns. Raad, I mean, let's just talk about China a little bit. If China imports oil and gas from a lot of places, how might sort of a re-emphasis of this US geopolitical power, if you like, in terms of its energy exports, if that is emphasized even more, will China need to react in any way? Does it have plenty of other sources of supply in terms of the leverage that the US could put on China, with regards to their trade negotiations, etc.? Would China need to diversify further, or not? Would it change the balance of what it takes from the Gulf, for example, versus US? How do you see that perhaps playing out?
I mean, I think certainly on the oil side, some of the disruptions and some of the new trade that have played out, again, as Bill said, have played out over several years, and you've seen, a rewiring of oil flows, as Rachel mentioned, sort of as a result of the Ukraine war. I think, what it comes down to in the short term for China is probably going to be the question of Iran. And that actually also goes back to the question of oil prices that Rachel mentioned. I mean, you have a sequencing issue here. It's fine to talk about trying to boost U.S. domestic production. It's fine trying to talk about sort of drill, baby, drill. The reality is that there are commercial issues and there are commercial objectives that drive oil production and drive expansion and investment in oil production in the United States. And Trump can change those on the margin, but he probably isn't going to be able to change some of the fundamentals, and it takes time to feed through. And so in the very short term, and this goes back to China, it comes down to the issue of Iranian exports. If the US really does reapply maximum pressure and can find ways to squeeze Iranian exports, one that's going to hit China with, potentially 800 to 1 million barrels a day of production that it needs to source from elsewhere. But it's also going to take that volume out of the market and start to sort of feed in on price. So over the next 2 quarters, you're probably likely to break out of the sort of 70 to 75 range, or it's more likely that you will break out of that range than start to hit 65, 60 and the sort of low energy prices that Trump has promised. But those are the kind of issues that will play out. It's one example of that. I think just to also pick up on something that Bill said that's very important in sort of the macro picture, and that is as you have energy transitions, the nature of energy security is changing. And it's not clear how disruptive Trump will be for that. It's no longer with renewables. It's not about access to the primary resource.
We're losing Raad's connection there, I think. I'm not the only one.
Brings, again, a new paradigm in terms of energy security that we haven't thought about, and one that potentially strengthens China and the rest of the world.
Okay, thanks, Raad. Rachel, what about the impact, if any, on America's relationship with Saudi? For example, obviously there's the price thing, and America wants, well, it's a producer as well, but there is a certain agenda there to keep prices on the lower side because of the political agenda in the States. What do you think having Trump 2.0 and whatever energy policy bring will do to the Saudi-American relationship in the context of also OPEC Plus and what it's been doing to sacrifice market share, let's say, for producers like the US, and bringing geopolitics into that? I mean, there's so many things in there, I know, but where do you see this relationship going? Trump-Saudi relationship has been quite strong in the past, but given the oil policy, where do you see that going?
Sure. And I think evidence suggests it will probably be strong going forward. I think one thing that will be interesting to watch, it seems like coming into the Trump administration, there's a bit more unity in the GCC as a whole. I mean, we'll see how that lasts. I mean, the Trump-Saudi relationship was quite strong in the first term, and that I think had some detrimental effects to the region, in a sense, with the blockade of Qatar and various other things going on. I'm oversimplifying. So look, I think, my view has been, I know there was a lot of optimism, not in the Gulf, around Trump coming in and around the picks for the energy sector in particular, right? And I do think they'll find interlocutors in the energy team that they're more comfortable with than those in the Biden administration. I think that even in Saudi Arabia and especially in the UAE, the shift that Trump is wanting to make on renewables and sort of moving away from that piece of the energy policy makes him a bit uneasy. But I think here how the relationship goes on is going to have a lot to do with how Trump manages both the Iran sort of question that Raad mentioned, but also the range of other issues in the Middle East. if I come back really briefly to something Raad mentioned on China just a moment ago, one thing that I think is shifting and will continue to shift is China's role not only as a consumer of fossil fuels, but also as a seller. And that's something I think we need to watch, especially in natural gas, where China is the largest contracted buyer of US natural gas and will become an even larger one going forward. And so they might play a role in reselling or allowing that fuel to go on to other buyers. And I'm thinking Europe particularly here. So China as both a place of extra refinery capacity and resale capacity, as well as having these small independent refineries that buy the Russian, Iranian, Venezuelan oil, I think is an interesting sort of swing player reselling and trying to take advantage of that arbitrage and maybe use it to their own advantages. Now, I think we're all coming to a view that it's harder to actually exercise some of these geopolitical advantages in practice, especially in the United States, where the industry is still run by private companies. Right. There are things the government can do to facilitate and de-risk. But at the end of the day, producers are going to produce if they think the market is there at the price they want. And that's something that I think makes the U.S. very different from Chinese producers, but also from the Saudis and Emiratis who are continuing to invest and add that capacity, even with the call on OPEC being so low and probably likely to stay low going forward, which I think has some problems.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I mean, Bill, what about China as a seller of solar panels and a seller of that technology, if you like, where it's clearly taken a lead globally? It does make some people in the US very nervous, not necessarily, if just because the US may or may not be going at a certain speed towards a transition, but it will have a dominant sort of position on the global stage in that. Do you think that would irk the Trump administration at all going forward? Would they tweak their investment policies accordingly? Again, would it pay attention to something like that?
It's not just solar panels. It's battery production capacity.
Batteries as well.
EV capacity. It's the wind industry.
Minerals.
China is got a massive amount of capacity, productive capacity there, and most of that's not going to go to the U.S. That's pretty clear. It's going to go elsewhere, and we've already seen it going elsewhere. We've seen Pakistan, for example, just add solar panels like gangbusters. I think you're going to see quite a lot of that. I was just down in South America, in Argentina and Chile. Lots of Chinese cars coming onto the market, many of them EVs. And I think, longer term, you're going to definitely see that coming in because they're coming in at very low prices. They're highly competitive, amazingly competitive. They'll get them into Europe even with 25% tariffs. They'll be quite competitive. Longer term, I think the question is are the Chinese willing to ultimately put the investment in the infrastructure of these emerging markets? Pakistan, for example, there's only so many solar panels you can put up before you screw up the whole energy system, unless you put the investment into reworking the energy system to absorb that amount of variable renewable energy. You need charging infrastructures in many of these places. You can sell EVs to a fair number of wealthy people around the world, but at some point, if you don't have a charging infrastructure, the market runs out. And I think that's the big question. And that's really China's big advantage that they're seeing this is, can we build these industries into giant global industries and dominate them? And to do that, they'll have to begin making pretty substantial, a kind of Belt and Road infrastructure plan with, kind of green objectives to it, whether they're, for environmental reasons or security reasons, or, a lot of other reasons that go beyond simply greening the world.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Raad, I'd like to go to you with a similar question to what I put to Rachel about the Saudi-US relationship, but expanding it into the Gulf, and really talking about Gulf producers, and how they may be seeing, Trump 2.0 coming in with this sort of drill, baby, drill again. We have a more bearish market this time around. There's, bearish outlook. We've got sort of energy transition having taken, obviously a bigger chunk of the market out of the conventional market in the last 4 to 6 years. So how do you think Gulf oil producers would be looking at a Trump presidency now from an energy sort of competition point of view?
Is far more aware of the realities of U.S. energy production, perhaps, than the president himself is in this case. And so I think there's an understanding of that balance between price, but also what it's going to take to build up U.S. production to really have the kind of expansion of U.S. production, certainly that Trump has talked about. I think there's also sort of a far greater and far more nuanced understanding of markets in the short term and the medium term. But it's pressures in both ways. I think there's a conventional wisdom that's the Gulf is happy to see Trump back, that they like his transactionalism. But Trump 1.0 came with several drawbacks and came with several lessons for the region, including for Saudi Arabia. And one was you can't always rely on the US to be there at times of crisis. And the US will operate on the basis of its own interests, not yours. So don't think of yourself as anything but a transactional partner. You're not an ally. You're not anything else. So I think the Middle East is going to, and the Gulf producers are going to continue doing what they've been doing all along. They obviously don't want prices to drop too far. They don't want to test the floor on prices over the next year. That would come with fiscal implications that several Gulf states, Saudi Arabia first and foremost amongst them, really can't afford given their domestic programs. And so there will be this continuous effort to take advantage where you can take advantage of the Trump administration, I think, and to act in the way that a number of middle powers are acting, which is to diversify your markets, to diversify your allies and your investors, and to diversify the links of power. And that's what you're going to see from the Gulf. And from an oil market perspective, I think that's that there's going to be a persistent focus on market management, on not allowing a floor to be tested, keeping prices at least where they are now, in the belief and with the understanding that any expansion in the US oil sector is going to take a lot longer and is probably going to be a lot smaller than Trump rhetoric has suggested.
Yeah, and of course, there's all the infrastructure that has to back that up, isn't it? And thanks, Raad. Bill, I'd like to touch on India, and we'll look at that survey question afterwards. That's in the title of this question, really. Again, I mean, this push by Trump doubling down on more energy exports, on sort of cementing their position as the leading exporter in the world. Does it have an impact on India more than it has already? Obviously, we've also seen Russian oil going to India in the last 2 years as one outlet where it's been allowed to go. Does that have an impact at all on that in terms of the US having an influence on that? Again, how do you think India is looking at potential Trump 2.0 policies on the energy front?
Well, India's always been very much on board with an all-of-the-above energy policy, and so they'll be thrilled if more energy is coming onto the market in any form they can find it and use it. That includes LNG, oil, gas, coal. So, a world of plentiful energy is a world the Indian economy will embrace. But that also means, you'll also see India continuing on with all of the above, including a lot of renewables. Like a lot of solar is going to come on. They're installing batteries quickly. So, I think they're generally pretty on board with a Trump world in that respect, at least.
Okay, and does it make them feel more energy secure or less energy secure in that sense? I mean, yeah.
I think more, because there's more out there to be gotten, whether they get squeezed. I don't see the Trump administration doing any more than the Biden administration did about their purchasing Russian oil, for example.
Yeah.
So no, I think generally they're pretty in line with the whole thing.
Okay, let's have a look at this survey question. What would be the most? Oh, it's gone again. What will be the most significant? Can we have it back again? I'm sorry, I missed reading it out, but I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to answer that. If you can put it back on, team, we can have a look at it. What will be the most significant geopolitical impact of America's energy independence push? Will it be increased competition in global energy markets, driving down prices and reshaping trade dynamics? The sort of systemic changes that we were talking about earlier, enhance US geopolitical leverage through its exports, diversification of energy import strategies by those consumers, China and India being two of them, accelerated adoption of renewable energy in nations like China and India. Again, I mean, India also has quite an ambitious energy transition agenda as well, but as Bill said, doesn't shy of taking whatever it takes and using whatever it can get its hands on. Rachel, back to you. Let's talk a bit about politics as well, just pure politics in the middle, within the context of how the US administration is going to have an impact on the Middle East from your perspective with Trump coming in. Are we going to see deals being done and magic happening in the Middle East and everything's going to be okay in the next 6 months, as Trump has been saying? He wants to get out of the region. He wants to, solve these wars and leave. What do you foresee we're going to see on the ground here in the Middle East as a result of Trump?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of US presidents try to get out of the Middle East and not be involved in the conflicts, and that probably hasn't gone as smoothly as they hoped. I do think, the real question is, or part of this question is, how much of the dynamics in the Middle East is the US going to delegate to, sort of partners and the like? Obviously, sort of questions about Israel and the like. But also, what dynamics, say, in Syria, might the Gulf countries be in a place, and Turkey, for that matter, be in a place to sort of influence, and the U.S. steps back? I think Trump himself has that goal. He wants to do deals. He may announce some things as large deals that maybe have less substance to them in the short term. But I think there's also going to be a lot of other sort of things coming on the agenda. The sort of what happens with the war, with Russia's war in Ukraine, which is no longer maybe a day one issue, but it's been talked about as a 6 months issue that obviously has implications for the region. Trump's been pretty quiet on China and China tariffs and what he's going to do in this sort of interregnum transition period. And so I think that's also going to be a factor in the Middle East. We have the Saudi Arabia and the UAE really wanting to go into technology and AI, and will want a pathway to get access to those high-level chips that they were starting to get with the Biden administration. How will that play out with Trump? We've seen big announcements even earlier this week from Damak, for example, in the United States. Will the U.S. make a pathway for investment, or will security issues cobble that? I think there'll be deals announced, but it's important for us all to watch what the actual provision of capital is. In some ways, it makes us as analysts go back to how we used to track Chinese and Gulf announced deals in different countries. So I think there'll be a lot of news. And so it's going to be important for us to kind of watch that bottom line. On India, I think I agree with Bill. Yes, they'd like the all of the above. But I think there's going to be some interesting questions if the sanctions and shadow fleet kind of start to dissipate with Russia. Will they start paying more for energy? I think it's a blip maybe, but it might be something in the short term where, sort of watching, maybe there's an opportunity for the Gulf to come back into the Indian market. I know I've diverged away from the U.S.
but interesting.
Lots of moving pieces.
A lot of moving parts.
It behooves those of us, particularly based in the United States, to really shift our perspective and make sure that we're really thinking about how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah, and a brand new puzzle. Thanks, Rachel. Raad, I'll give you a minute just to close up for us, but the same question to you, but from your perspective of, peace in the Middle East, quote unquote. Do you see that we might see a changing dynamic, for better or worse, but the dial shifting in terms of Israel, Palestine issue. And of course, we have the new Syria equation. Do you see Trump somehow magically being able to put these problems to bed?
Okay. I think the Middle East is like crack cocaine to every incoming
dear.
administration. I mean, they probably think that they should stay away from it, but they get sucked in very, very quickly.
Oh, dear.
And, I don't think this administration is going to be any different. I think that said, in terms of its list of priorities, it may not be as high as it has been in the past. And I think this issue of potential delegation is an important one because it will make the Middle East much more of a power play even than it's been in the past. The Middle East is going through a really huge transformation at this moment in time. A lot of the foundations that we've come to assume in terms of analysis have been changed. And so, there is a risk that the US will actually do the worst of both things, that it won't back away and allow the region to come to its own solutions, but at the same time, it will meddle just enough to be destabilizing. But, peace in the Middle East, I don't think this is an administration that has any conviction that there should be a Palestinian state or an Israeli-Palestinian deal on the basis of any of the peace negotiations that have gone before. And I think sort of very quickly, the obsession with Iran is going to start coloring things. And leading to some fairly skewed decisions. So I don't see this as being a period where it's going to be a bright new age for the Middle East and possibly one where, as the region itself is working itself out, the US will be a disruptive external factor as opposed to one that actually enhances stability.
Well, that won't be in favor with its Gulf allies, would it? So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well. I mean,
It'll all be about
the Arab,
transactionalism.
the
And
Arab,
that's what I think the Gulf will be as transactional as the Middle East is,
the
US is.
As the Americas. Raad, thank you so much. Thank you to Rachel and to Bill. That half an hour went by very quickly, but thank you very much for joining us on the Global Outlook Forum today. And have a good remainder of the week and Happy New Year. And again, thank you for joining us, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
All the best.